Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. Today we have Adam Boyd with us, and he is going to be talking to us about the Byzantine text. More generally about that collection of manuscripts, that some of us think has a better text than the critical text. Anyway, Adam, why don't you go ahead and say hello to everybody?
Hi, everyone.
So Adam, why are you the way you are as a Byzantine text guy?
I could answer that in many ways, but I guess I came through to the Byzantine text. It was a bit of a process. I was taking an exegesis class at Fuller Seminary, and I had an assignment on textual criticism. I could choose a variety of texts to look at, but I chose John chapter 7, verse 8, where the critical text says, has Jesus saying, "I am not going up to this feast." But in the Byzantine text, Jesus says, "I am not yet going up to this feast." Now, I knew that the right answer was, "I am not going up to this feast," right answer being the one that the professors at Fuller Seminary would be looking for. But as I investigated it, I saw that there was quite a lot of evidence for the Byzantine reading. I'm a bit of a contrarian, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to write my paper supporting the Byzantine text. Actually, I didn't really know much about the Byzantine text at that point, but I was going to go with the variant that critical text advocates typically reject. And I remember one of my points in that paper being, I don't think John, who calls Jesus the way, the truth, and the life, would tell his narrative in such a way that makes it sound like Jesus was lying to his brothers. Right. And I think that's what it comes down to. The critical text variant, Jesus is, you could try to sugarcoat it, but he's clearly lying to his brothers because he does go up to the feast. And in the Byzantine text reading, he's not lying to his brothers. He's saying, I'm not going now. He says, now is not my time. Your time is whenever. I'm not going now. And so Jesus is not lying. And that's important to me, because I know who Jesus is. Jesus is not somebody who lies. And so it seems like the critical text there is just an error because right. I don't see that's how John would portray Jesus. Long story short, after graduating from seminary, I read through the entire Greek New Testament using the UBS Greek New Testament Reader's Edition, that has the parses and the vocabulary at the bottom. And after doing that, I wanted to read through the Greek New Testament without all of those notes to try to test myself. And I wanted to find a nice, clean presentation of the text. And I found that the 2005 Robinson-Pierpont edition was really clean, really nice to read. Mm-hmm. And so I got that. And that's where I was exposed to the Case for Byzantine Priority, the essay by Maurice Robinson that was in the back of that text. I read that essay and I was very convinced by the arguments and ultimately became a Byzantine text advocate as a result.
So if we go back to that variant, that's a really interesting variant because that's one that's a rather, popular is the wrong word for it, but a rather well-known variant because it, like you said, it seems to suggest that Jesus is lying to his disciples and that he eventually did go up to the feast. What would you say to somebody who would suggest that it's actually the critical text reading because what the Byzantine scribes were doing is they recognized the problem too and wanted to make Jesus out to not be a liar, and so they changed it?
I just don't see that there's a lot of proof of that sort of argument. And one of the things I dislike about textual criticism is there are all sorts of assumptions and presuppositions that are made that I just don't see a lot of basis for. You could make any sort of argument to support any sort of reading. You could make that argument. Well, where's the proof? Where's the evidence that they were doing that? If you look at, Caldwell did a study of singular readings in manuscripts, in the early manuscripts. And, a singular reading is a reading that occurs only in one manuscript. So you can be almost certain that it's not the original text. It's some sort of scribal change. Looking that over, most of the changes made the text harder to read. They didn't make it easier to read. And so this mantra, I'll follow the harder reading, it doesn't really make sense in light of the evidence.
Right.
I am not going up to this feast is a harder reading because it portrays Jesus as lying to his brothers. I'm not yet going up to this feast is not the harder reading. And generally, the early scribes, when they made a change, whether intentional or unintentional, it made the text harder to read.
Yeah, and that's I think I was talking about this to Michael in my last interview, the World English Bible translator, who I didn't know that until I had a chance to talk to him. We were talking about how when it comes to textual issues, that it seems more probable and more likely that a scribe would inadvertently drop something out of the text instead of adding something in. The example I used was back when I was working for the big corporate guy, right? Emails back and forth. That's the way that you communicate with everybody. And there was something to do with a a software development project I was on. I was writing an email saying something along the lines of, I will not be participating in this project or something like that. And when I hit the send button, as we all know, the send button is the best spell checker in the world. And it turns out I didn't put the word not in there. So I gave them the false impression that I was actually part of the project when I was not part of the project. I mean, you just in my random typing, right? I see that I just simply draw. And that's a mistake I make actually rather frequently, going over social media posts and other emails and things like that.
I have an example like that too. I was working for a Christian organization, and I was working with an outside vendor who was not Christian. And this lady sent me an email, and she meant to write, "Hello, Adam." But she was very embarrassed because later on, after she sent the email and I replied, she realized that she'd written "Hell, Adam," and so she dropped the O. And that's it was still an understandable variant, but it wasn't what she was intending, and it was a harder thing to understand.
And another thing that I find when I'm typing emails or responding to people is when I'm writing out the name Chris, I have a hard time not writing Christ. I always put the T on the end of that, and I usually have to go backspace. Anyway,
when I try to type the word body, I almost always type Boyd because that's my last name.
Nice. Yeah, it just gets into our muscle memory, right? Yeah. So now when it comes to the positive reasoning for Byzantine text, there's also a negative reasoning for the critical text. What is it about the critical text that kind of makes you go, nah, you know what? I don't really like that one. I prefer the Byzantine over the critical text.
What I find to be the most convincing is when you string together the variants in the critical text. I think it's fairly well known that there are at least 105 verses in the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament that when you string together the variants in those verses, you cannot find any manuscript whatsoever that has that exact reading. So you can look at each variant individually and make an argument. Oh, this is the correct variant because of such and such. This is the correct variant because of such and such. You string them all together, and now you've come up with a reading that you can't find in any manuscript. And I find that to be quite implausible that the original text of the Greek New Testament would not be preserved in at least one manuscript. And that would happen more than 100 times over the course of the Greek New Testament. I don't believe that.
Yeah, so the so-called Frankentext. So I've heard this a number of times. In fact, Stephen Hackett just had Maurice Robinson on his channel, and they were talking a little bit about this specific issue where verses in the critical text oftentimes have can go no more than the length of a single verse, where there's it's some sort of textual unit, like they can't find that specific thing, that specific verse in a manuscript, in a single manuscript, right? As you're saying, they're piecing together little bits here and there. But where do you find these passages? Like, do you have any examples of some passages where this is the case?
Yeah, a great example is Matthew 19:29. This is the ESV translation. "And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life." So there's two variants here. The first one is houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands. The only manuscript that says it that way is Vaticanus, Codex Vaticanus. That's the only one. All of the other manuscripts add in the word wife, say, or wife or children or lands.
Right.
Okay. And the other variant is 100-fold. Now, there's a lot of manuscripts that say 100-fold, but Vaticanus is not one of them. Vaticanus says manifold. You see that when you put those two variants together, you don't have any manuscript whatsoever that reads the way this ESV translation reads. So ESV is translating, as you called it, a Frankentext. It's not actually translating from any manuscript for the entirety.
So how many did you say there were of these in the critical text?
I read an article once that said there were at least 105.
Oh, wow. I mean, that would take a lot of work to be able to pin these down, right? Because you need to know a lot of manuscripts in order to be able to say with any certainty that, this is a Frankentext. So how many manuscripts are we looking at when it's almost certainly not all of them, is it?
I believe these 105 verses were put together from the Nestle Aland critical notes.
Okay, so based on their own apparatus, there's spots where. Okay, that makes sense. That's fair.
So that's why I would say at least 105. There could be more, but based on the available data, there've been 100, at least 105 have been found.
Let's go back to Vaticanus. So you mentioned Vaticanus in this variant, and amongst textual critical scholars today, they kind of see Vaticanus and Sinaiticus as, two of the most important witnesses that we have of the Greek New Testament. In fact, I think I reached out to Dan Wallace like way back in 2008 or something, just through email, and said, which manuscript's the most important? And he just sent back a one-word email and it said Sinaiticus on it. Would you see these two manuscripts as like our most important witnesses, or like, I know they're not Byzantine, but I guess the question isn't, do you see these as important? But the question is how important do you see these manuscripts as being in regards to a Byzantine priority position?
I don't see them as any more important than any other manuscripts. The idea that these are more important than others seems to stem from the idea that the vast majority of manuscripts all stem from a single source, which has been proven not to be true. We have all of these later manuscripts that are copies of earlier manuscripts, and there's very few that we can actually link together genealogically as saying this one was copied from this one.
Right.
And so, an 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century manuscript, they're almost all orphans in a sense, that you can't identify a manuscript that they were copied from. And so they're preserving a copy of a copy, we don't know how many generations, of an earlier manuscript. And so I think they should all be considered equally. I don't put Vaticanus or Sinaiticus above any others.
In light of being a Byzantine Prioritist, how do you see preservation? How has God preserved his word? Is it word by word, letter by letter, meaning by meaning?
Yeah, although I'm a Byzantine Text priority person, I believe that the manuscripts were copied, very normal, natural process. Somebody had the original, they made a copy of the original, somebody made a copy of the copy, somebody else made a copy of the copy. Through that process, you would expect that most people got it right. Most people copied it correctly. And when they made a mistake, it didn't propagate. Right. And so somebody might make a mistake. They might, instead of saying hello, Adam, they might write hell, Adam. Well, the next person recognizes that's a mistake. They find a different copy and copy from that instead, at least for that particular part. So I feel it's a very self-governing process. And over time, we find that, this, 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts, none of which are identical, but which all point to the same text. You might find a few here that make mistakes, a few there that have something strange. But if you take the aggregate, man, you got a very solid text. So I put a lot of confidence in the text that we have. I don't necessarily subscribe to a divine preservation viewpoint. I know probably a lot of your viewers would, but I think that just through the normal process of copying, we have preserved a very accurate copy of the books of the Greek New Testament.